He grabbed a microphone in front of hundreds of people and mocked the woman who sold her grandmother's jewelry to build his empire. She did not cry. She did not argue. She simply walked toward the exit, and he smiled like he had won something. He had no idea he had just lost everything. What this man never knew was that the woman he just humiliated in public had been carrying his child the day she signed those divorce papers. A child he never met. A daughter he never knew existed. And that daughter? She was standing in that very ballroom when he picked up that microphone, watching every single second. Now here is what I need you to sit with for a moment. This man spent 15 years convincing the world he built his billion-dollar empire alone. But the woman he just mocked in public worked 2 jobs, sold everything she had, and handed him the foundation of that empire with her bare hands. And she never told a soul, not even their daughter. So ask yourself this. If someone sacrificed everything for you and you repaid them with public humiliation, what would justice actually look like? Because within 72 hours of that gala, his daughter walked through the doors of his corporate headquarters. Not as a guest, not as a visitor, as the lead investigator assigned to tear his company apart from the inside. The man who thought he controlled every room he walked into had no idea. Destiny had already beaten him to the door. And before we go any further into this story, I want to ask you something honestly. Have you ever given everything you had to someone, your time, your energy, your absolute best, only for them to act like you never existed? If that hit close to home, stay right here, because this story was made for you. And if you're new to this channel, welcome to Echoes of the Heart with Dr. Collins. This is the place where real stories about real human experiences remind us of who we are, who we were, and who we still have the power to become. Make sure you hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a story that could change the way you see your life. Now, let's go back to where this story truly begins. The man the world admired and the woman the world forgot. There's a particular kind of arrogance that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive wearing a villain's costume or carrying a sign that reads danger. It creeps in quietly. It disguises itself as ambition. It calls it self-drive. And by the time anyone recognizes it for what it truly is, entire lives have already been swallowed whole. That was the kind of arrogance that lived inside Marcus Everett Calloway. Not the loud, theatrical arrogance of a man who needs a room to notice him. No, Marcus carried the quieter, more dangerous kind. The kind that comes from genuinely believing that everything good in your life exists solely because of your own brilliance. He was 44 years old, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and carried the kind of posture that made people instinctively step aside when he walked into a room. The financial press called him a generational talent. Business schools studied his acquisition strategy. A documentary about his rise from a 2-room apartment in the Midwest to the corner office of Callaway, Continental Industries, had won a regional award 2 years earlier. To the outside world, Marcus Calloway was a self-made legend. To the people who loved him, he was a cautionary tale. But we are not starting at the end of the story. We are starting at the beginning. Because the beginning is where you find the man before the money found him. 22 years before that charity gala, the office was barely larger than a storage closet. 2 mismatched desks pressed against opposite walls. A single window that faced a brick building across the alley. A coffee maker that hummed like it had a personal grievance against silence. And somewhere beneath a mountain of manila folders, business plans, and rejection letters, a young man named Marcus Calloway was trying to save a company that technically did not yet exist. He was 22 years old. He had $43 in his checking account. He had been rejected by 11 investors in the past 2 months. And he was eating a bowl of instant noodles at 9:30 in the evening when the door opened and a young woman walked in carrying 2 paper bags, a smile that had no business being that warm after a 12-hour shift, and the quiet confidence of someone who had already decided that this man's dreams were worth fighting for. Her name was Diana Brooks. She set the bags down on the edge of his desk and pulled out a container of homemade soup, a small loaf of bread she had baked the night before, and a napkin she had folded into the shape of a tiny airplane, because she knew he needed to laugh more than he needed another business plan. Marcus looked up from his papers. "You worked a double shift today," he said. "I did." She replied simply, sitting down in the chair across from him. You should be home sleeping. I will sleep when the investor presentation is finished, she said. Hand me the third section. Your transition from slide 9 to slide 10 makes no sense, and it will cost you the room. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he handed her the papers. That was Diana Brooks. Not glamorous in the way that magazine covers define glamour, but magnetic in the way that actually matters. She was the kind of woman who remembered that your coffee had no sugar before you remembered it yourself. The kind of woman who stayed up until 2 in the morning helping you rehearse your pitch, then woke up at 5 to get to her first job before the sun came up. The kind of woman who, when the jewelry box that held her grandmother's pearls and gold bracelets sat on the dresser as the last valuable thing in the apartment, picked it up quietly one Saturday morning and came home 3 hours later with a check that covered Marcus's first business registration fees and 3 months of office rent. He cried that day. He actually cried. He held her face in both hands and told her he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never had to sacrifice another thing for him. She smiled and said, I am not sacrificing anything. I am investing. She had no idea how prophetic those words would become, and she had no idea how completely they would eventually be forgotten. If you are watching this right now, and you have ever been the person in the background, the one who believed in someone before the world did, the one who gave quietly while they received publicly, I want you to stay with this story. Because what happens next is going to matter to you deeply. And if this story already has your attention, do me a quick favor right now. Tap that like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells me that you are here and that these stories are worth telling. Now, let us continue. The years that built an empire and dismantled a marriage. Success did not arrive for Marcus Calloway the way it arrives in movies. It did not come in a single triumphant moment with swelling music and a slow clap from admiring strangers. It came in layers. First, a small contract with a regional logistics company, then a larger contract, then a partnership, then an acquisition, then another, then a feature in a business publication that led to a speaking invitation, that led to a connection, that led to a deal worth more money than Marcus had made in the previous 5 years combined. And with each new layer of success, something subtle happened. Not something that would register on any financial statement, not something visible in any boardroom, but something that Diana felt in her bones long before she could name it. Marcus began to edit his own story. It started small enough that she almost missed it. At a dinner with new business associates, he described launching his first company as a solo venture born from sheer personal determination. Diana sat across the table and said nothing. She told herself it was just conversational shorthand, that he simply did not want to bore strangers with complicated backstory. At a magazine interview, the journalist asked about his early struggles, and Marcus spoke for 20 minutes about sleeping on an air mattress in the office, surviving on minimal resources, and believing in himself when no one else did. Diana read the published article 3 times looking for her name. It did not appear once. She did not bring it up. She cooked dinner that evening, asked about his upcoming trip to Chicago, and reminded herself that marriage was not a ledger and that love did not require credit. But the edits kept coming. A corporate anniversary party where he gave a speech about founding the company and thanked his early team by name. Every member of that team, every advisor, every early investor. Diana sat at table 7 and smiled. Her name was not mentioned. The night they drove home from that party, the car was absolutely silent for 11 minutes. Diana counted, not because she was angry, but because she was trying to understand how a person who knew every detail of what she had given could stand at a podium and find no space for her existence. She finally said, "You forgot to mention me." He glanced at her briefly. It was a business event, Diana, not a personal tribute. She turned to look out the window. "I sold my grandmother's jewelry," she said quietly. "We have talked about this," he replied, "and I have more than replaced everything financially. You want for nothing. I do not want replacement jewelry. Marcus, I want to be remembered." The car stayed silent for the rest of the drive home. That was the night Diana understood something she had been refusing to accept. Money had not just changed Marcus's net worth. It had changed his memory. By the time Callaway Continental Industries became one of the most recognized corporate brands in the country, Marcus had fully constructed the version of himself that the world would come to celebrate. He moved through life with the practiced ease of a man who had rewritten his own autobiography so many times that he had genuinely begun to believe the newest version. The mansion they moved into had 12 bedrooms and a library that Marcus had professionally stocked but rarely used. Diana had a garden in the back where she grew tomatoes and herbs and occasionally sat alone reading books she actually finished. They attended events together. They smiled for photographs. They said the right things to the right people. But the truth, the quiet and devastating truth, was that they had stopped truly seeing each other somewhere around year 4 of the marriage. And by year 6, the conversations that remained were largely logistical. Then came the voices from outside. Board members who suggested, with polished corporate indirection, that Marcus's public image required a certain kind of partnership, that the wife of a man at his level needed to project ambition, sophistication, and a particular social currency that they were not entirely sure Diana possessed. Marcus never directly repeated these conversations to Diana, but she felt them. In the way he began suggesting she dress differently for events. In the way he would slightly redirect conversations at dinner parties when Diana started speaking about her volunteer work with children's literacy programs. In the way he once said, at the end of an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday evening, "You do not have to come to the Wellington dinner next month. It is mostly industry people. You would find it boring." She looked at him for a long time. "Would I find it boring?" she asked carefully. "Or would you find it complicated to explain me?" He did not answer. She went to her garden and stayed there until the stars came out. The divorce, when it finally arrived, was not dramatic in the way that word usually implies. There was no shouting, no strondischis, no single catastrophic event that became the official cause of death for a marriage that had taken years to quietly bleed out. There was simply a morning in early spring when Marcus came downstairs and sat across from Diana at the kitchen table, where they had shared hundreds of breakfasts, and told her that he thought it would be best if they separated. Diana held her coffee cup with both hands. She looked at him steadily. "Best for whom?" she asked. He did not answer that question either. The divorce proceedings were handled by attorneys and completed with the kind of cold efficiency that only money can purchase. Diana did not fight for the mansion. She did not fight for the investment portfolio, the offshore accounts, or the collection of art that hung on walls she had personally chosen. She accepted the legal minimum. She packed a single suitcase, and she walked out of the front door of a home she had decorated, maintained, and quietly held together for 6 years without once being acknowledged for any of it. Marcus watched her go from the second-floor window. He told himself he felt nothing. He was an exceptionally skilled liar, especially to himself. Now, right here, I want to pause for just a moment, because I know some of you watching this have been in a version of this place. Maybe not a mansion, maybe not a billion-dollar company, but you have been in a relationship, a friendship, a partnership, or a family dynamic where you gave everything you had and received nothing but invisibility in return. And when it ended, you were the one who walked away quietly while they kept everything that your sacrifice helped build. If that is your story, I want you to know something. The chapter where you walked away quietly was not your ending. It was just the beginning of something they could never have predicted. Stay with me, because this is where the story truly starts to turn. And while you are here, take a moment to share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. You never know whose life a single story can reach. Now, let us keep going. What he never knew she was carrying. Diana discovered the pregnancy 11 days after the divorce was finalized. She was sitting in a small clinic on the east side of the city, in a waiting room with plastic chairs and a water cooler that made a noise every 4 minutes like a punctual complaint. She had gone in for what she assumed was stress-related exhaustion. She had barely slept in the weeks surrounding the divorce proceedings, had lost weight she could not afford to lose, and had been running on the quiet determination of a woman who refused to let herself collapse in public. The doctor, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s with reading glasses she wore pushed up on her forehead, came in with a file and sat down across from Diana with the measured calm of someone delivering news that required careful landing. "Mrs. Brooks," she began. "It is Ms. Brooks now," Diana said softly. "I just recently finalized a divorce. The doctor nodded gently. Ms. Brooks, I want to share your results with you, and I want you to take a moment after I do. Diana straightened slightly in her chair. You are pregnant, the doctor said. Approximately 7 weeks. The water cooler made its noise. For minutes, Diana sat completely still. She was not thinking about the mansion. She was not thinking about the suitcase, currently sitting in the corner of a rented studio apartment 3 miles away. She was not thinking about Marcus Calloway, or the attorneys, or the morning he sat across from her at the kitchen table and could not answer a simple question. She was thinking about her grandmother's pearls. She was thinking about the tiny paper airplane that Diana had once folded from a napkin just to make an exhausted young man smile. She was thinking about the words she had said in a car 11 minutes of silence ago. I do not want replacement jewelry. I want to be remembered. And now, sitting in a plastic chair under fluorescent light, she understood that she was going to be a mother. She pressed both hands flat against her stomach, and she made a quiet decision that would define the next 20 years of her life. She was going to be everything to this child. Diana tried to reach Marcus. I want to be clear about this because the truth matters and this story deserves honesty. She tried. She called his office 4 times in the first week. His assistant, a young man with a precisely professional voice, told her each time that Mr. Calloway was unavailable, but that she could leave a message. She left messages. Specific, calm, important messages. Each one said the same essential thing, that she needed to speak with Marcus about something significant and time-sensitive, that it was not about the divorce settlement, that it was personal and important. Not one call was returned. She wrote 3 letters. Real letters. Handwritten on cream-colored paper. Letters that explained, clearly and with no bitterness, that she was pregnant and that she believed he had a right to know he was going to be a father regardless of what had happened between them as a couple. The first letter received no response. The second was returned unopened with a brief note from his legal team stating that all correspondence from Ms. Brooks should be directed to the firm handling the divorce settlement and that Marcus had no further personal communications to engage in. The third letter she kept. She never sent it. She kept it in a small wooden box under her bed, the same box that now held the single photograph she still had of the 2 of them from the early days. Before the money, before the magazine covers, before the careful editing of a shared history. She waited outside a corporate conference center one cold November morning where she knew from a public news article that Marcus was scheduled to speak. She stood for 2 hours in the kind of cold that turns breath visible and makes standing still feel like a task requiring genuine will. When he finally emerged with a group of executives, she stepped forward and said his name once. He looked at her. There was a flicker of something across his face. Recognition, and then almost immediately a deliberate blankness. His head of security, a large man who moved with the trained efficiency of someone paid specifically to prevent uncomfortable situations, stepped between them before Diana could say another word. Ma'am, the security officer said, not unkindly. Mr. Calloway is between engagements. If you have a matter to discuss, please contact his office directly. I have left messages, Diana said, keeping her voice steady. I have written letters. I have a matter that is genuinely important. Mom. That was all. She stood on that sidewalk and watched the motorcade of black vehicles pull smoothly away from the curb and disappear around the corner. She placed one hand on her stomach, and she made the second great decision of her life. She stopped trying, not out of defeat, out of dignity. If this man had constructed a life so thoroughly sealed against her existence that not even the news of his own child could find a way through, then she would not spend one more day of her pregnancy knocking on walls that had been deliberately built to keep her out. She would go home. She would build something of her own. And she would raise this child to understand that the absence of one person's love does not define the total amount of love available in a life. The girl who grew up rich in all the ways that matter. Vivian Elena Brooks came into the world on a Tuesday morning in late August. She arrived with considerable energy and very little patience, which, Diana would later tell her, was the clearest indication that she was always going to be someone who moved toward things rather than away from them. The hospital room was small. The only person in the waiting area was Diana's college friend, A woman named Priscilla who had driven 4 hours without being asked because that is what real friendship looks like. There are no photographers, no press releases, no flower arrangements delivered by corporate assistants. There was just a mother and a daughter meeting each other for the first time. Diana held Vivian for a very long time before saying anything. Then she whispered into the tiny ear pressed against her chest, "You are the best thing I ever built. And I built you all by myself." That was both literally and emotionally true. Vivian grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood that was not featured in any real estate magazine, but was populated by the kind of people who left casseroles outside neighbors' doors when someone was sick and who organized block parties with folding tables and borrowed speakers and the sort of relaxed communal joy that money cannot manufacture. Diana worked. This is the part of the story that deserves to be said plainly and without softening, because it is the part that built the woman Vivian eventually became. Diana worked mornings as an administrative coordinator at a mid-size accounting firm. She worked Tuesday and Thursday evenings teaching an adult literacy program at the public library 3 blocks from their apartment. She picked up freelance, grant-writing work on weekends when Vivian was old enough to spend Saturday mornings with Priscilla's family next door. There were lean stretches. There was a winter when the heating bill and the grocery budget were in direct competition with each other, and the heating bill lost for 2 weeks in January. There was a birthday, Vivian's 7th, where the cake was baked from a box mix with the wrong flavor frosting because that was what was on sale, and Diana had decorated it with strawberries cut into tiny star shapes using a paring knife and the determined creativity of a woman who refused to let limitation become the defining feature of a celebration. Vivian remembered that birthday as one of the best of her life, not despite the circumstances, because of what lived inside them, because Diana Brooks, even in the leanest of times, never made her daughter feel that love was a resource subject to scarcity. On the subject of her father, Diana kept a careful, consistent honesty. When Vivian was 4 and asked where her daddy was, Diana said, "He is living his own life, sweetheart." Some people need a lot of time to figure out who they really are. When Vivian was 7 and came home from school crying because a classmate had asked why she did not have a dad at her school concert, Diana sat with her on the edge of the bathtub and said, "The people who show up for you are your family. Count those people. You will find more than enough." When Vivian was 12 and found an old photograph at the bottom of a kitchen drawer, a photograph of a young woman and a young man laughing in front of a tiny rented office, and brought it to Diana with wide eyes and said, "Is that him?" Diana sat down at the kitchen table, folded her hands, and told the truth. Not all of it. Not the letters that went unanswered. Not the November sidewalk. Not the security officer with the trained efficiency and the single repeated word. But the essential truth. "His name is Marcus Calloway," she said. "He was someone I believed in completely. And I think somewhere inside, he was someone worth believing in. He just got lost along the way." Vivian looked at the photograph for a long time. "Does he know about me?" she asked. Diana was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Vivian counted later and told her she had counted. "I tried to tell him," Diana said finally. "He was not in a place where he could hear it." Vivian put the photograph down on the table between them. "Okay," she said, and then she went back to her homework. That was the moment Diana understood that she had somehow managed to raise a child whose emotional intelligence exceeded her own at age 12. Vivian was exceptional in ways that had nothing to do with giftedness in the conventional academic sense, and everything to do with the quality of attention she brought to every room she entered. She listened in a way that most people do not. Not listening while preparing what to say next, but actually listening, taking in, processing, sitting with. Her teachers noticed, not because she was the loudest student, because she was often the quietest one, and yet somehow managed to ask the question that made the entire room go still, because it was the one question no one else had thought to ask. She was accepted to one of the country's most competitive law programs on the strength of a personal essay that her admission interviewer later described, in a phone call to the admissions committee, as the most emotionally intelligent piece of legal writing I have encountered from an applicant in over a decade. The essay was about watching her mother fold strawberries into tiny stars on a birthday cake and understanding, for the first time, what the word abundance actually meant. Are you still with me? Because we are about to enter the part of this story where everything changes. And before we do, I want to ask you something. Think about someone in your life who has been building quietly, working without recognition, showing up without applause. Maybe that person is you. Maybe it is someone you love. If this story is speaking to that person, share it right now. Let someone who needs it find it. These stories only reach the people they are meant for when we pass them forward. Now, let's talk about the evening that set all of this in motion. The gala, the microphone, and the moment that could not be undone. The Callaway Continental Industries Charitable Foundation Annual Gala was held on a Friday evening in early October. The venue was a restored historic ballroom in the center of the city, the kind of space that made even wealthy people pause in the doorway to take it in. Soaring ceilings with original plasterwork. Chandeliers that predated the building's renovation by 40 years and had been kept specifically because someone with genuine taste had insisted they were irreplaceable. A stage at the far end flanked by floral arrangements that had required a separate truck to transport. 314 guests attended. Politicians, corporate executives, philanthropists, a handful of celebrities who had attached their names to causes the foundation supported, journalists with press credentials and photographers with the instincts of people paid to find the single most significant frame in any room. Marcus Callaway moved through it all like a man at home in his own mythology. He wore a deep charcoal suit that had been selected by someone whose entire professional existence revolved around ensuring he looked exactly like what the room expected. He greeted guests by name, shook hands with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent 2 decades learning to perform genuine connection. He laughed at the right moments. He leaned in at the right moments. He said exactly enough and never one word more. He was extraordinary at this, which is part of what made what happened next so inexplicable. Diana Brooks had been invited to the gala by the director of the Children's Literacy Foundation, where she had volunteered for the past 11 years. The organization had received a substantial grant from Callaway Continental's charitable arm, and several of the foundation's lead volunteers had been extended an invitation as a courtesy acknowledgement of their community work. Diana had hesitated. She was aware, of course, that this was Marcus's event. Priscilla, who had driven 4 hours without being asked the day Vivian was born and had remained the most consistently honest person in Diana's life ever since, sat across from her at her kitchen table 3 days before the gala and said, "You have every right to be in that room. You earned a place in that room before he had a room. Go." Diana went. She wore a simple navy dress that she had owned for 3 years, and that fit her with the effortless elegance of clothes chosen by a woman who dresses for herself rather than for the room. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She wore no expensive jewelry, just small gold earrings that had belonged to her mother. She sat near the back of the ballroom at a table with 4 other volunteers from the Literacy Foundation, a group of warm, engaged, purposeful people who spent the first hour of the evening talking about reading programs and funding gaps and the particular joy of watching an adult learn to read for the first time at age 53. Diana was genuinely having a good evening. She had not come to see Marcus. She had come for the children her work served. She had almost forgotten he would be in the room. Then the lights on the stage brightened, and there he was. Marcus Callaway at 44 occupied a stage the way certain people do. Not by filling it with volume or theatrics, but by simply being in it in a way that made everything else in the room feel like background. He spoke for 11 minutes about leadership, about resilience, about the responsibility that comes with success, about using what you have built to build something for others. He was compelling. Diana would acknowledge this to herself privately and without bitterness. He had always been a good speaker. In the tiny office with the mismatched desks and the coffee maker with a grudge, he had practiced speeches out loud to an audience of 1, and Diana had listened and given notes and told him exactly which lines landed and which ones needed work. She sat in the back of the ballroom and watched him speak and felt the peculiar emotional mathematics of encountering someone who was once the most important person in your world and is now a stranger whose face you recognize but whose interior you no longer know. She was not angry. She was not sad. She was simply present. And then he looked toward the back of the room. Their eyes met. For a moment, just a fraction of a moment, something crossed Marcus Calloway's face that Diana could not entirely name. Recognition, certainly, and something beneath it, something older and more complicated. Then it was gone. His expression resettled into the polished, comfortable certainty of a man who had spent years deciding what his face was allowed to show in public. He looked back at the audience, and then, he smiled into the microphone with the practiced ease of someone delivering a charming aside and said, "You know, success has a funny way of attracting people from a past. Individuals who perhaps did not find their own path, but seem very interested in observing someone else's arrival." Polite laughter rippled through the room. He continued without pause. "It is one of the more interesting social phenomena of public life. The further you climb, the more faces appear in the crowd who would like you to believe they had something to do with the view." More laughter, warmer this time. A few nodding heads from people who interpreted the observation as a general, relatable comment about success and its complicated social orbit. But Diana understood exactly what it was, because only one face in that room had looked at him from the past at that precise moment. Only one person in that ballroom carried the specific weight of their shared history. She felt the color leave her face. She did not make a sound. She set her napkin down on the table beside her untouched dessert. She stood, and she walked toward the exit with the quiet, upright composure of a woman who had spent 20 years deciding that her dignity was the one thing no one would ever take from her again. 3 people at her table watched her go and said nothing because they did not fully understand what had just happened. One person in that ballroom understood completely. She had been standing 12 feet to the left of Diana's table for the past 40 minutes. She had come to the gala representing the firm that had recently been appointed to conduct a sweeping corporate ethics investigation into 3 of the country's largest conglomerates. She had a glass of sparkling water in her hand. She had her mother's posture, and she had eyes that Marcus Calloway's mirror would have recognized instantly if he had ever bothered to look carefully enough. Vivian Brooks set her glass down on a nearby table. She watched her mother walk out of the room. She turned and looked at the man on the stage, still receiving his applause. And she thought 2 things in rapid succession. The first was very calm. The second was not. We're going to stop right here for one moment, because I need to ask you this directly. What would you have done in Vivian's position? Your mother, humiliated publicly by a man who does not even know he is your father, at an event you are both attending for professional reasons, with 300 people in the room and cameras capturing everything. What would you have done? Put your answer in the comments right now. I genuinely want to know. And I read them, all of them, because this channel exists for this kind of conversation. This is Echoes of the Heart with Dr. Collins, and if this story is moving you, please subscribe right now, because what happens next is the part that is going to stay with you long after this video ends. The weight of a name she had never used. Vivian did not follow her mother out of the ballroom immediately. She stood for a moment longer, watching Marcus Calloway accept his applause and step down from the stage and be immediately surrounded by the particular constellation of associates and admirers that powerful men accumulate the way expensive suits collect lint. She studied him, not with hatred. This is important to understand. Not with the burning, immediate emotion that the word hatred implies, with something quieter and significantly more unsettling. Assessment. The same focused, unhurried attention she brought to every complex case file that landed on her desk. The same deliberate mental cataloging she applied when meeting a witness or reading a financial disclosure or walking through a crime scene. She noted the ease of his manner, the practiced fluency of his social navigation, the way he moved through the room as though every space he occupied had been specifically arranged for his benefit. She noted the lines of his face, the set of his jaw, the particular angle of his profile when he turned to speak to someone on his left. She had seen that profile once before, in a photograph at the bottom of a kitchen drawer, a photograph of 2 young people laughing in front of a tiny rented office. She picked up her sparkling water, finished it in 2 measured sips, and walked out of the ballroom. She found her mother sitting on a bench in the lobby near the main entrance. Diana's hands were folded in her lap. Her back was straight. Her face was composed. She was looking at the large floral arrangement near the reception desk, as though it were mildly interesting. Vivian sat down beside her. For almost a full minute, neither of them said anything. Then Diana said, very quietly, "I should not have come." "You had every right to be in that room," Vivian said. That was not her own sentence. She was returning the words that Priscilla had given her mother 3 days earlier, though she did not know that. Diana turned and looked at her daughter. Vivian met her eyes. "Mom," Vivian said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth, even if you think the truth is going to upset me." Diana was quiet. "Was that him?" Vivian asked. Diana held her daughter's gaze for 4 seconds. Vivian knew because she counted the way she always had. "Yes," Diana said. Vivian nodded once. Slowly. The way she nodded when she had received a piece of information that confirmed something she had already calculated but needed external verification for. She looked at the floral arrangement across the lobby. "He has no idea who I am," she said. It was not a question. "No," Diana said softly. Vivian sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not panic when I tell you." Diana turned to look at her again. "The investigation I have been appointed to lead," Vivian said carefully. "The corporate ethics review that my firm was assigned to 3 weeks ago." "Yes," Diana said slowly. "It includes Callaway Continental Industries." The lobby was very quiet. A server walked past them with a tray of empty glasses. The sound of applause drifted faintly from the ballroom on the other side of the wall. Diana closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them. "Vivian," she said, "listen to me very carefully." "I'm listening," Vivian said. "You are going to conduct that investigation with the same integrity and the same impartiality that you would bring to any other case. Do you understand me?" "I know that, Mom." "I'm not finished," Diana said. Her voice was steady in the way that Diana's voice became steady when she was drawing on something very deep. "You're going to do your job exactly as it should be done. Not harder because of who he is. Not softer because of who you are to him. Exactly as it should be done." Vivian looked at her mother. "You are remarkable," she said quietly. "I'm a mother," Diana said, "which means I am remarkably terrified right now, and I am choosing not to show it." Vivian almost smiled. "Almost." "Go home, Mom," she said. "Let me take you home." "I drove myself," Diana said. "I know you drove yourself. I will drive you. We will get your car tomorrow." Diana looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she stood, and they walked out of the building together into the cool October night. Behind them, in the ballroom with the irreplaceable chandeliers, Marcus Calloway was laughing at something someone had said and had already entirely forgotten the brief, uncomfortable eye contact with a face from his past. He would not forget it for much longer. If this story is connecting with you, and I believe it is because you have made it this far, I want you to do one thing right now. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, because this is what we do here at Echoes of the Heart. We tell the stories that remind us what human beings are capable of. The sacrifice, the resilience, the quiet dignity of people who chose to do the right thing even when no one was watching. And the moments when the truth finally arrives, not with noise, not with drama, but with the kind of calm, steady certainty that can only come from a life built honestly. Part 2 of this story is coming, and it is going to be the part that changes everything. But before we get there, tell me in the comments right now, do you think Vivian should recuse herself from this investigation? Or do you think she is exactly the right person to lead it? Because the answer to that question is more complicated than it first appears. And the next chapter is going to show you why. The morning after and the weight of what was coming. Vivian Brooks did not sleep that night. Not because she was emotional, though she was. Not because she was angry, though a clean, quiet version of that was certainly present somewhere beneath the surface. But because Vivian's mind, when confronted with a problem of genuine complexity, did not know how to simply set it down and rest. It cataloged. It organized. It ran scenarios the way a chess player runs moves. Not one step forward, but 4, 5, 6 steps deep, examining every possible consequence of every possible action before committing to a single one. She sat at the small desk in her apartment with a cup of tea that went cold before she touched it, and she spread 3 folders across the surface in front of her. The first folder contained the formal appointment letter from the Independent Oversight Committee that had assigned her firm to lead the corporate ethics review. Her name was on it. Her signature was on the acceptance. The appointment had been publicly announced 2 weeks prior in a press release that had generated considerable attention in legal circles because of her age, 31, and because of the scope of the investigation, which covered not one, but 4 major corporate entities with combined assets exceeding $40 billion. The second folder contained the preliminary case summary for Callaway, Continental Industries specifically. Financial irregularities flagged during a routine regulatory audit. Specific concerns around charitable foundation fund allocation, which struck Vivian with a particular private irony given that she had spent the previous evening at a charitable foundation gala hosted by the very entity under review. Procurement contracts awarded to subsidiaries with undisclosed ownership connections. 3 whistleblower complaints filed internally over an 18-month period, all 3 of which had been formally dismissed by the company's own compliance department. The third folder was empty. She had placed it on the desk intentionally. It was for everything that could not go into an official case file. The personal dimension. The conflict of interest question that she would need to answer not for the committee or the court, but for herself. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. The legal answer to the conflict of interest question was technically navigable. Her connection to Marcus Callaway was biological but entirely undisclosed and unestablished. There was no formal legal relationship. No court had ever recognized her as his daughter. No document anywhere on earth carried both their names. She had grown up as Vivian Brooks, daughter of Diana Brooks, and that was the complete official record of her existence. She could, from a strict procedural standpoint, continue leading this investigation without any mandatory disclosure requirement. But Vivian had not spent 3 years building a reputation for ethical precision in complex legal proceedings by doing what was merely technically permissible. She had built that reputation by doing what was actually right, which meant the empty folder was where she needed to spend the next several hours. She picked up a pen. She wrote 1 question at the top of the first blank page. The question was this: what does integrity require of me in a situation where the correct answer is not the comfortable one? She underlined it twice. Then she began to write. By 6:30 in the morning, the tea was still cold and Vivian had filled 11 pages. By 8 o'clock, she had made her decision. By 8:45, she was dressed and in her car. By 9:15, she was sitting in the office of her firm's senior partner, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had been practicing law for 38 years and who had the particular quality of attention that comes from 3 decades of hearing things that cannot be unheard. Gerald Whitmore was 67 years old, compact, sharp, and possessed of the most precisely organized desk Vivian had ever seen in a professional environment. He sat across from her with his hands folded and his expression completely neutral, which was the expression he wore when he was giving something his fullest possible attention. Vivian told him everything, not the version edited for a professional distance, the full version. The photograph in the kitchen drawer. The conversation on the bathtub edge when she was 7 years old. The name her mother had said at a kitchen table when she was 12. The ballroom the previous evening. Her mother's face when Marcus Callaway's words landed. The bench in the lobby. The conversation. Gerald Whitmore listened without interrupting for 14 minutes. When she finished, the office was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What is your recommendation?" Vivian appreciated this about him. He did not tell her what to think. He asked what she thought. "I want to remain on the investigation," she said. "But I believe full disclosure to the Oversight Committee is required. My connection to the subject entity is indirect and legally unestablished. However, it is real. The committee should be made aware and should make the determination about my continued appointment with full information." Gerald studied her for a moment. "And if they remove you?" he asked. "Then I was removed because the process worked correctly," she said. "And that is an outcome I can live with." Gerald unfolded his hands. "Write the disclosure memo," he said. "I will co-sign it. We submit it to the committee this morning." "Thank you," Vivian said. "Do not thank me," Gerald said, with the dry precision of a man who found gratitude for basic professional integrity slightly puzzling. This is simply what the work requires. Vivian stood to leave. Vivian, Gerald said. She turned. Whatever the committee decides, he said carefully. The fact that you walked into this office this morning instead of saying nothing tells me everything I need to know about why you were appointed in the first place. Vivian held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and walked out. The Oversight Committee met in emergency session that same afternoon. 3 members, a retired federal judge named Constance Adeyemi, who chaired the panel, a former regulatory commissioner named Patrick Holt, who had overseen 4 major corporate reviews in his career, and an independent legal ethics consultant named Miriam Osei, who had written 2 of the most widely cited papers on investigative impartiality in complex commercial cases. They read the disclosure memo. They asked Vivian 6 questions. 2 were procedural. 2 were factual. 2 were the kind of questions that are designed not to gather information, but to observe how a person handles pressure. Vivian answered all 6 with the same steady, undecorated honesty. Judge Adeyemi studied her for a long moment after the last answer. Then she said, "Ms. Brooks, the committee has 3 options. We can remove you from the investigation entirely. We can assign a co-lead to provide oversight of your work. Or we can retain you as sole lead with enhanced transparency protocols and a formal acknowledgement that this disclosure occurred." Vivian said nothing. She had been asked no question. "We are choosing the 3rd option," Judge Adeyemi said, "for 2 reasons. First, because your legal and investigative work on this appointment was selected on the basis of exceptional professional merit, and replacing you introduces risk to the integrity of the process that outweighs the risk your disclosed connection presents. Second, and here the judge paused for just a moment, because the manner in which you handled this disclosure is itself the clearest possible evidence of the character this investigation requires." Patrick Holt leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Brooks, one additional condition. Under no circumstances is the personal connection between yourself and the principal subject of the Callaway Continental Review to influence the investigative direction. Not in his favor. Not against it." "Understood," Vivian said. "We will be watching," Miriam Osei added. "Not as a threat, as a statement of professional commitment." "Good," Vivian said. "So will I." Now I want to stop here and speak to you directly for just a moment, because what Vivian just did in that office and then in that committee room is something that we do not talk about enough. She had every reason to say nothing. She was legally protected in her silence. The investigation would have proceeded. No one would ever have known, and the outcome, whatever it turned out to be, would have been procedurally defensible. But she chose disclosure anyway. She chose integrity over convenience. And here's what I want you to think about as this story continues. The most important decisions we ever make are almost never the ones where doing the right thing is obvious and easy. The most important decisions are the ones where doing the right thing costs us something, where it puts us at risk, where no one would blame us for choosing the comfortable path instead. Those are the moments that actually define who we are. Have you ever had a moment like that, where you chose the harder, more honest path when the easier one was right there? Tell me about it in the comments. I would genuinely like to know. And while you are there, make sure you are subscribed so you are here for part 2 of this story. Because what happens when Vivian walks into Marcus Callaway's corporate headquarters is going to be something that stays with you. Now, let's keep going. The headquarters, the hallway, and the man who did not yet know. Callaway Continental Industries occupied the top 14 floors of a glass and steel tower in the financial district that had been featured in 3 separate architectural publications since its construction 6 years prior. The lobby was the kind of space designed to communicate one thing above all else: power. Soaring ceilings, marble floors in a pale gray that reflected light in a way that felt almost deliberate. A reception desk staffed by 3 people at any given time, each one dressed in the company's signature charcoal and white color scheme. Each one trained to project the particular brand of courteous authority that wealthy institutions use as their first line of social management. Vivian walked in on a Wednesday morning at 9:58. She wore a dark charcoal blazer over a white blouse. Black trousers. Simple, low-heeled shoes chosen specifically because she had learned early in her career that comfortable footwear in a long day of institutional navigation was a strategic advantage, not a style compromise. Her briefcase was slim and dark and contained, among other things, the formal investigation notice that she was required to present upon arrival, the preliminary document request list that ran to 4 pages, and a small photograph of her mother that she carried in every briefcase she had ever owned. She walked to the reception desk and stated her name and her purpose clearly and without unnecessary elaboration. The receptionist, a young man with excellent posture and the professionally pleasant expression of someone trained to remain unruffled, looked at the investigation notice she placed on the desk, read it once, read it again slightly more carefully, and then picked up the phone. The person he called was Marcus Calloway's chief of staff, a woman named Renata Chu who had been operating at the center of the Calloway organization for 9 years and who was widely considered the most unflappable person in the building. Renata Chu's voice, when she appeared in the lobby 6 minutes later, was professionally warm and entirely controlled. She was 52 years old, precisely groomed, and moved through the lobby with the brisk efficiency of someone whose calendar was a document of extraordinary density. "Ms. Brooks," she said, extending her hand. "I am Renata Chu, Chief of Staff. We received the preliminary notification from the Oversight Committee last week. We have prepared a conference room on the 31st floor for the initial meeting." "Thank you," Vivian said, shaking her hand. "I will need access to the following departments for initial document review." She produced a copy of the request list and offered it. Renata took it without looking at it immediately. "Of course, I will need to review this with our legal team before confirming access timelines. The investigation notice you received last week includes the statutory access provisions," Vivian said pleasantly. "Document production timelines are specified in Section 4. Your legal team is welcome to verify, but the provisions are not subject to negotiation." A brief pause. "Of course," Renata said, with the slightly recalibrated pleasantness of someone who had just encountered a professional boundary and was deciding how to respond to it. "Mr. Calloway will join us shortly. He has a brief this morning that runs until 10:15. "That is fine," Vivian said. "I will begin reviewing the conference room setup in the meantime." She followed Renata into the elevator without looking back at the lobby. The conference room on the 31st floor had a full glass wall facing the city and a table that seated 16 people. Vivian sat at the midpoint of the table, not the head. A deliberate choice. She was not here to dominate a boardroom. She was here to conduct an investigation, which required observation more than performance. She opened her briefcase and arranged her materials precisely. Document request list to the left. Investigation timeline to the right. A notepad in the center, plain white, no company letterhead. Her pen uncapped and ready. She looked at the city through the glass wall. She had looked at this building from street level many times over the past 3 weeks as she prepared for this appointment. She had studied its annual reports, its publicly filed financial disclosures, its charitable foundation documentation, its board composition, its subsidiary structure. She had deliberately not looked at photographs of Marcus Calloway. She had seen enough of his face the previous Friday evening. She did not need to see it again before she was ready. The conference room door opened at 10:22. Marcus Calloway walked in. He was followed by 2 attorneys from his legal team, a junior associate who carried a leather portfolio and looked slightly terrified, and Renata Chu, who closed the door behind the group with quiet precision. Marcus scanned the room in the practiced, automatic way of a man accustomed to assessing every space he enters. His gaze moved from the window to the table arrangement to the woman sitting at its midpoint. He stopped, not visibly, not in a way that anyone in the room would have specifically registered. But Vivian registered it, because she had been watching for exactly that. She stood as he approached. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Vivian Brooks, lead investigator for the Independent Ethics Oversight Committee." He shook her hand. His grip was firm and automatic and entirely professional. His eyes, however, were doing something that his handshake was not. They were searching. She watched them search without giving them anything to find. "Ms. Brooks," he said. His voice was exactly as it had sounded at the gala. Measured, assured, calibrated to project authority without announcing it. "Welcome to Callaway Continental. I want to assure you that we intend to cooperate fully with this review." "That is appreciated," Vivian said. She gestured to the chairs. They sat. An investigation of Callaway Continental Industries formally began. The first session lasted 3 hours and 14 minutes. It was on its surface entirely procedural. Vivian outlined the investigation scope, her team's access requirements, the document production timeline, the interview schedule that would eventually include Marcus himself, though that session was not yet scheduled, the confidentiality provisions, the reporting structure. She spoke clearly, precisely, and without any note of personal inflection. Marcus listened with the focused attention of a man who understood that he was in a situation requiring his full presence. He asked 3 questions, each one sharp and legally specific, which told Vivian that he had been thoroughly briefed by his attorneys and was not approaching this review with anything other than complete seriousness. His attorneys asked another 11 questions. Vivian answered all 14 without hesitation and without consulting her notes. One of his attorneys, a senior partner from a prominent firm whose name Vivian recognized from several high-profile corporate matters, leaned slightly toward Marcus at one point during her explanation of the whistleblower complaint review process and said something quietly. Marcus's expression did not change, but he glanced at Vivian once more with the same searching quality she had noticed during the handshake. At the end of the session, as papers were gathered and chairs pushed back, Marcus stood and extended his hand again. "We will have the first document batch ready by Friday," he said. "Thursday end of business is the statutory requirement," Vivian said, shaking his hand. "Friday would require a formal extension request." He held her hand for 1 fraction of a second longer than a standard handshake. Not inappropriately, not obviously, just a fraction. "Thursday," he said. "Thank you," she said. She released his hand, picked up her briefcase, and walked toward the door. She did not look back. In the elevator going down, she stood with her back straight and her briefcase held in both hands, and she looked at the floor indicator above the door as the numbers descended, and she breathed in a slow, deliberate rhythm that she had learned from her mother a long time ago. Her mother, who was at work right now at the accounting firm 3 miles away. Her mother, who had walked out of a ballroom 5 days ago with her head high and her hands steady and her dignity entirely intact. Vivian pressed the photograph through the leather of her briefcase with her left thumb without opening it. Then the elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. She walked out into the marble and light of the ground floor and through the front doors into the morning air of the city. She had 7 minutes before her next call. She used 4 of them standing on the sidewalk, breathing the outside air and reminding herself of the question she had written at the top of a blank page at 2 in the morning 4 days ago. What does integrity require of me in a situation where the correct answer is not the comfortable one? She had answered it once. She would need to keep answering it. Every single day of this investigation. What the documents revealed and what the man refused to see. The document review took 11 days. Vivian's team worked from a dedicated review space on the 29th floor of the Callaway building that the company had provided as part of its cooperation agreement. 4 attorneys, 2 forensic accountants, and a data analyst worked in rotating shifts to process the first production of materials, which arrived Thursday afternoon in 17 boxes and 4 encrypted digital file transfers. Vivian reviewed everything herself in addition to overseeing the team. She slept 5 hours a night during those 11 days. She ate meals at her desk and drank more tea than was probably advisable and called her mother every evening at 8:30 without exception, always making sure the conversation stayed well away from anything connected to the investigation, which meant they talked about other things. Books Diana was reading. A new volunteer who had joined the literacy program, who could not yet read a clock, but could recite 12 poems from memory. A tomato plant in Diana's garden that had survived an early frost through what Diana described as sheer personal stubbornness. "Sound familiar?" Vivian said one evening. Diana laughed. A real laugh. The kind that meant she understood exactly what her daughter meant and chose to receive it as the compliment it was. Those 8:30 calls were the steadiest thing in Vivian's life during those 11 days. What the documents revealed was significant. Not in the dramatic, explosive way that corporate scandal tends to be depicted in films. Real financial irregularities rarely announce themselves with obvious labels and clear villain signatures. They reveal themselves in the accumulation of small details that individually might be explainable, but collectively constitute a pattern that cannot be coincidental. The charitable foundation allocations were the clearest thread. Over a 4-year period, the Callaway Continental Charitable Foundation had disbursed approximately $62 million in grants to a variety of recipient organizations. On the surface, the disbursements were appropriately documented, appropriately distributed across a range of legitimate causes, and appropriately reported in the Foundation's annual filings. Beneath the surface, however, Vivian's forensic accounting team identified a recurring pattern in which 14% of disbursements across a 4-year period had been directed to organizations that shared registered addresses, board members, or operational administrators with subsidiary entities in which Callaway Continental held undisclosed interests. In plain language, the company had been directing charitable money to organizations that were functionally connected to itself. The amount was not devastating on its own, but the structural nature of the arrangement suggested intent, which meant the investigation would need to establish who had known, who had approved, and when. The whistleblower complaints added another dimension. All 3 complaints, filed by different employees in different departments over 18 months, describe a consistent pattern of pressure from senior leadership to approve procurement contracts without standard due diligence review. 2 of the complaints specifically named a senior vice president of operations. One mentioned a conversation with the CEO directly. One mentioned Marcus Callaway by name. Vivian read that particular complaint 3 times. Then she set it down on her desk and looked at the wall for approximately 90 seconds. Then she picked it up again and continued working. There is something I need to tell you about Vivian in this moment because it matters to understanding everything that comes next. She did not feel satisfaction when she found the irregularities. This is not the story of a daughter who spent her life waiting for an opportunity to destroy her absent father. That version of this story would be simpler and significantly less interesting. It would also be untrue to who Vivian Brooks actually was. What she felt, sitting across 11 days of documents in a borrowed review room 31 floors above the city, was something closer to grief. Not for herself, not even entirely for her mother, for the waste of it, because everything she was reading told her that Marcus Callaway was, by any objective standard, an exceptionally gifted businessman. His strategic instincts were visible in the architecture of the company he had built. His understanding of market dynamics, of operational efficiency, of long-term positioning, was genuinely sophisticated. The legitimate core of Callaway Continental Industries was a company that employed 6,000 people, generated substantial economic value, and had done genuine good through its charitable activities alongside the compromised portions. He had built something real. He had also permitted and potentially directed a set of practices that undermined it. And he had done so, she suspected, not out of pure greed, but out of the same fundamental flaw that had been present in him since the beginning. The need to control the story, the compulsion to manage outcomes, the deep, unexamined conviction that the rules applied to everyone in the room except the person who believed he had built the room himself. The same instinct that had erased Diana from his public narrative. The same instinct that had stood at a microphone 5 days ago and mocked a woman in front of 300 people. The same instinct that had, 22 years ago, constructed walls so impenetrable that the news of his own child could not find a way through. It was not a malicious instinct. It was a frightened one. And fear, dressed in the costume of power, becomes capable of exactly the kind of damage she was currently documenting. She wrote none of this in any official report, but she understood it completely. And that understanding was what made her the right person to be sitting in this room. On the 11th day of the document review, Marcus Calloway appeared in the doorway of the review space at 4:45 in the afternoon. This was unexpected. Renata Chu appeared behind him with the slightly compressed expression of a person who had advised against this particular visit and been overruled. Vivian looked up from the document she was reviewing. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "this is an active review space. Unscheduled visits from company leadership during document production are not standard protocol." "I know," he said. He had this slightly unusual quality in that moment of a man who was aware he was doing something he probably should not be doing and had decided to do it anyway. "I will only take a moment." Vivian looked at the other members of her team, who had all gone carefully still in the specific way that trained legal professionals go still when something procedurally irregular is happening and they are waiting for guidance. "Everyone take a 10-minute break, please," she said. The team filed out with practiced efficiency. Marcus stepped fully into the room. Vivian set her pen down. He looked at the wall of organized documents and file markers and the whiteboard where her team had mapped out a structural diagram of the subsidiary relationships under review. He looked at it for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he looked at her. "You are very thorough," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know you were at the gala last Friday." "I was," she said. "I saw you." Near the end of my remarks. "I know," she said. He looked at her steadily. That searching quality again. More present now than it had been in the formal first session. Less controlled. "You look familiar to me," he said. "I have been trying to understand why." Vivian held his gaze. This was the moment. Not the formal moment. Not the procedurally correct moment. That moment had its own proper time and place and structure. But this was the human moment. The one that could not be scheduled or outlined or managed. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "I imagine there are many faces in your life that you do not fully recognize, Mr. Calloway. People who were present in chapters of your story that you have not yet revisited." He was quiet. The room was very still. "I would like to schedule your formal interview for 2 weeks from today," she said. "My assistant will send the confirmation to Renata tomorrow morning." She picked up her pen. After a moment, he said, "Of course." He walked to the door. He stopped at the threshold. Without turning around, he said, "The woman at the gala. The one who left during my remarks. Do you know her?" Vivian looked down at the document in front of her. "She is my mother," she said. The doorway was silent. She did not look up. After a moment, she heard his footsteps move away down the hallway. She set her pen down again. She looked at the wall of documents. She breathed in the slow, deliberate rhythm her mother had taught her. And then she picked her pen back up and kept working. And right here, before we go any further, I need to take a moment. Because what just happened in that room is one of the most important moments in this entire story, and I want you to feel the full weight of it. Vivian did not explode. She did not accuse. She did not use the power of her position to settle a personal score. She answered one question with 3 words and went back to work. She is her mother's daughter in every possible sense of that phrase. And the man in the hallway now knows something that is going to change every remaining hour of his life. He just does not know how much yet. We're getting there. But right now, I want you to comment 1 word in the comment section. Just 1 word. The word that describes how you are feeling at this moment in the story. 1 word. Right now. And please, if you have not subscribed yet, do it right now. Not for me. For yourself. Because the next chapter of this story is the one that brings everything together. And you do not want to miss it. This is Echoes of the Heart with Dr. Collins. The hallway, the mirror, and the man coming apart. Marcus Calloway did not sleep that night either. He sat in the study of his penthouse apartment, a room he had designed specifically to project the image of a man at peace with his own success. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves stocked with books he had genuinely read, which he always made a point of telling people, as though reading the books you own is an achievement requiring acknowledgement. A desk that had once belonged to a prominent industrialist from the early 20th century, purchased at auction for a sum that his financial advisor had described as enthusiastic. A single lamp that cast warm light across the room in the evenings and made the whole space feel like the study of someone who had arrived. He sat behind the desk and looked at nothing. "He is my mother." 3 words. 3 words delivered with the calm, unhurried precision of someone laying a single card face up on a table and then returning quietly to their own hand. He had driven home from the office in complete silence, which was unusual for him because Marcus typically used his commute to take calls, dictate notes, or listen to financial briefings. He used time the way he used everything else. Efficiently, without waste. Tonight the car was silent, and the city moved past the windows, and he looked at nothing. "He is my mother." He turned the sentence over. He turned it over again. The woman who had left the ballroom during his remarks. He had not thought about her carefully since that evening. He had filed the encounter in the particular mental drawer, labeled uncomfortable, and moved efficiently past it, the way he moved past most things that did not immediately require his attention or serve as forward momentum. But the face in the review room, the face that had been looking at him across a conference table for 3 hours during the initial session, the face that had held his gaze without flinching, without performing, without giving him a single thing to work with in terms of the social cues and emotional signals that Marcus had spent decades learning to read and respond to. He had kept reaching for why she felt familiar and kept arriving at nothing concrete. Now, he was arriving at something. He opened the top right drawer of the antique desk. Inside, beneath a leather portfolio and 2 fountain pens he never used, was a small photograph he had kept there for reasons he had never fully examined. It was from the early years. 2 young people standing in front of a small rented office on a street that no longer existed in that form. The young man was grinning with the specific grin of someone who has just received a piece of news that feels too good to be entirely real. The young woman beside him was laughing, her head slightly tilted, one hand raised as though she had just said something she found genuinely funny and was still enjoying it. He had not looked at this photograph in almost 4 years. He looked at it now. He looked at it for a very long time. Then he set it down flat on the desk and pressed both hands against the surface and closed his eyes. Diana Brooks. The name moved through him like something physical. Not a thought, more like a weather event. Something that arrived from a direction he had not been watching and covered the entire sky before he had time to prepare. Diana Brooks, who had worked 2 jobs. Diana Brooks, who had folded a napkin into a paper airplane. Diana Brooks, who had carried a box to a jewelry shop on a Saturday morning and come home with his future in an envelope. Diana Brooks, whom he had last seen through the second-floor window of a house she had made into something that deserved a better word than home as she walked down the front path with a single suitcase. Diana Brooks, who had appeared at the back of a ballroom last Friday evening and whom he had looked at across a crowded room and felt something old and complicated move through his chest, and whom he had responded to by picking up a microphone and saying the worst possible thing in the worst possible way in front of 300 people. He opened his eyes. He looked at the photograph again. Then he looked at the mental image he now could not stop constructing. The woman in the review room. The particular set of her jaw. The way she held his gaze. The steady, undecorated quality of her attention. He picked up his phone. He set it down. He picked it up again. It was 11:47 at night. He set it down again. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his study and felt something happening inside him that he had no professional vocabulary for. Something that was not about business or strategy or positioning or management. Something that was simply about what he had done and what it had cost and what he was only now, at 44 years old, in a room full of books he had genuinely read and furniture purchased to announce his arrival, beginning to actually count. The phone call that changed the temperature of everything. He called Renata at 7:15 the following morning. Renata Chu, who had been awake since 5:45 and was already at her desk working through the morning briefings, answered on the second ring in the voice of someone who had been expecting this particular call since approximately 4:45 the previous afternoon, when she had watched Marcus Calloway stand in the doorway of the document review room and make a decision she had privately assessed as inadvisable. "Good morning," she said. "I need you to find something for me," Marcus said. His voice carried the specific texture of a man who has not slept, but is functioning through it on the particular fuel of people who have spent their lives treating rest as optional. "Of course," Renata said. "What do you need?" "I need any publicly available information on Vivian Brooks." The investigator. A pause. Brief. Professional. Mr. Calloway, Renata said carefully. Given the active investigation, any research into the lead investigator's personal background would require very careful consideration from a legal standpoint. I would strongly recommend consulting with outside counsel before. Publicly available information, Renata, he said. Professional biography. Published work. Public record. Nothing that requires counsel. Another pause. I will have it on your desk by 9, she said. Thank you. He ended the call. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse and watched the city come alive below him. Delivery trucks and early morning pedestrians and the particular light of a city morning that looks completely different from 30 stories up than it does from street level. He had spent 20 years looking at the world from 30 stories up. He was beginning to wonder what he had missed at street level. The file Renata assembled was thorough in the way that Renata's work was always thorough, which is to say it was complete, organized, and presented without editorial comment, leaving Marcus to draw his own conclusions. Vivienne Elena Groux, 31 years old, graduate of the public school system in the Eastern District of the city. Scholarship recipient at 17 to one of the country's most competitive undergraduate institutions. Law degree from a program ranked consistently in the top 5 nationally, completed in the upper 2% of her class. Clerkship with a federal appellate judge. 3 years at a boutique firm specializing in regulatory compliance before being recruited to her current firm at 28. 2 published papers in legal ethics journals, both of which have been cited in subsequent scholarship more times than most practitioners see in an entire career. 1 award from a national legal foundation recognizing emerging professionals whose work demonstrated exceptional commitment to public interest principles. 1 appointment, recent and publicly announced, as lead investigator for the Independent Oversight Committee review covering for major corporate entities. And at the bottom of the biographical summary, because Renata was as thorough as she was careful, a single line that read, simply mother listed in public records as Diana Brooks, currently employed in the city, community literacy volunteer. Marcus sat with the file open on his desk for 20 minutes without moving. Then he picked up his personal phone, not the business line, the personal one, and he called his attorney. Not the corporate legal team, his personal attorney, a man named Stuart Graves who had handled his private legal matters for 16 years and who, most relevantly, had handled the divorce proceedings 22 years ago. Stuart answered on the 3rd ring with the unhurried ease of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by the unusual nature of Marcus Calloway's requests. Marcus, he said. Stuart, Marcus said. The divorce from Diana Brooks. 22 years ago. A pause. I remember it, Stuart said. After the divorce was finalized, Marcus said. Were there any attempts at contact from Diana? Letters, calls, anything that was flagged and handled by the office? A longer pause this time. Marcus, Stuart said. Why are you asking me this now? Answer the question, Stuart. The line was quiet for several seconds. Then Stuart said, there were some attempts at contact, yes. In the months following the finalization. My office handled them in line with your standing instructions at the time, which were to redirect all contact from your former spouse through the legal channel rather than allowing direct personal communication. Marcus was very still. What kind of contact, he asked. Phone messages primarily, marked urgent by your assistant at the time, though the nature of the urgency was not specified, and I believe there were letters. How many letters? I will need to check the archive file, but my recollection is 3, possibly 4. Were they read? Another pause. The first was reviewed by my paralegal to assess whether it constituted a legal matter requiring response. It was determined to be personal in nature and was filed without further action per the standing redirect protocol. Personal in nature, Marcus repeated. That was the assessment at the time, yes. And the others? Were handled according to the same protocol. Marcus, the instructions at the time were clear. You had indicated that you did not wish to maintain personal contact, and we acted accordingly. Marcus pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. Stuart, he said, I need you to find those letters. Marcus, find them. All of them. I need to know what they said. A long pause. It may take some time to locate archived materials from that period, Stuart said carefully. How much time? A day. Perhaps 2. You have until tomorrow morning. Marcus said. He ended the call. He set the phone down. He looked at the file on his desk. At the single line at the bottom, mother listed in public records as Diana Brooks. He thought about a cold November morning outside a conference center. He had never told anyone about that morning. About the woman who had stepped forward and said his name once. About the security officer who had stepped between them. About the motorcade that had pulled smoothly away from the curb. He had filed that memory in the same drawer as uncomfortable and moved efficiently past it. He pulled it back out now. He looked at it carefully for the first time, and what he saw, looking at it with 22 additional years of information, made him feel something in the region of his chest that he did not have a clean word for. He had one word that was approximate. The word was shame. Right here, I want to acknowledge something important, because some of you watching this are feeling something complicated right now about Marcus. Some of you are feeling the first edges of sympathy for a man who has, up to this point in the story, been very difficult to sympathize with. And I want to sit with that feeling rather than rush past it. Because here is the truth about human beings that good storytelling keeps returning to. People are not simply good or bad. They are not heroes or villains. They are collections of choices, some made from love, some from fear, some from the particular blindness that privilege and pride create when they're allowed to go unchallenged long enough. Marcus Calloway made devastating choices. He erased a woman who had given him everything. He constructed walls that blocked the news of his own child's existence. He stood at a microphone and humiliated a person in front of 300 people. These are not small things. They are not things that a moment of realization cancels or erases. But they're also not the complete definition of a human being. And what happens in a person when the full weight of what they have done finally arrives, when the walls come down and the accounting begins, is one of the most important things a story can show us. Because most of us have something we are not yet fully facing. Something we have filed in the drawer labeled uncomfortable and moved efficiently past. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for Marcus Calloway. I am asking you to watch what happens to a person when they finally stop running. Because that part of the story belongs to all of us. The letters and the weight of 22 years. The letters arrived on Marcus's desk the following morning. Stuart Graves had sent them over by private courier in a sealed envelope with a handwritten note that said only, "I am sorry I did not handle these differently at the time." That sentence, coming from a man Marcus had known for 16 years and had never once heard express professional regret, told him more about the contents than anything else could have. There were 3 letters. Each one was handwritten on cream-colored paper in a handwriting he recognized immediately even after 22 years. Diana had always written with the particular clarity of a person who thought carefully before committing pen to paper. He opened the first one. He read it once. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again. The letter was dated 9 days after the divorce was finalized. It was written with the measured care of someone who had clearly spent time on each word, making sure that nothing in the language could be read as aggressive, manipulative, or designed to reopen the marital wound that had just been closed. It said that she was pregnant. It said the pregnancy was approximately 7 weeks along. It said that she was not writing to challenge the divorce or make any financial request. It said that she believed he had a right to know that he was going to be a father, regardless of what had passed between them as a couple, because that was a matter that existed separately from their marriage and its ending. It said that if he wished to have no involvement, she would respect that decision absolutely and would raise the child without making any claim on him beyond what was legally required. It said that she simply needed him to know. It closed with the words, "I hope you are well." I genuinely mean that. It was signed, Diana. Marcus set the letter down on his desk. He was aware of several things simultaneously. He was aware that his hands were not entirely steady. He was aware that the room felt smaller than it had 4 minutes ago. He was aware that there was a sound somewhere in the building, a distant air conditioning unit or an elevator mechanism, or something equally mundane that seemed very loud. He opened the second letter. This one was dated 6 weeks later. The tone was slightly different. Not bitter, not demanding, but carrying the particular weight of a person who has already been trying for some time and is beginning to understand that trying may not be enough. It said she had called the office multiple times and left messages. It said she had sent one letter that she assumed had been received. It said she was now entering her third trimester. It said that she had not changed her position on his right to know or her willingness to manage alone if that was his choice. It said only, "Please acknowledge this letter so that I know it has reached you." It closed with the same words. "I hope you are well. I genuinely mean that. Signed, Diana." He opened the third letter. This one was the shortest of the three. It was dated 4 months after the second. It said, "I had our daughter 11 days ago. Her name is Vivian. She is healthy and I am well. I tried to reach you several times over the past several months, and I understand now that you have made your decision. I will not try again. I wish you a good life." It closed without the usual line. It was signed simply D. He sat with the 3 letters arranged in front of him on the antique desk for a very long time. Outside the window, the city went about its business with the complete indifference of a world that does not pause for private reckonings. He thought about the security officer on the November sidewalk saying, "Ma'am." He thought about Renata's voice yesterday morning, careful and professional, when he had asked for publicly available information. He thought about a woman in a review room on the 29th floor saying, "She is my mother." He thought about a young woman he had never met who had grown up without him and had become, from everything her professional record indicated, someone extraordinary. He had not built that. He had not contributed to that. The person sitting in his building conducting an ethics investigation with the kind of integrity that had prompted his own senior partner to describe her as the most impartially principled investigator he had encountered in 30 years of practice. That person had been built entirely without him, by a woman he had erased from his public narrative and mocked at a charity gala. He put the letters back in their envelopes. He put the envelopes in his desk drawer. He sat back in his chair. And Marcus Calloway, who had not cried in a professional environment in 20 years, and who had spent most of those 20 years operating under the working theory that emotional responses were largely inefficient, pressed the heels of both hands against his eyes and stayed very still for a long time. The investigation, the interview, and the room where everything was said. The formal interview with Marcus Calloway was scheduled for 2 weeks after the initial session. It took place in the same conference room on the 31st floor, at the same table, beneath the same glass wall facing the city. This time, the arrangement was different. Vivian sat at the head of the table. Her 2 senior colleagues flanked her. A court reporter was positioned to the left. A recording device sat at the center of the table, its small red indicator light signaling active documentation. Marcus arrived with 2 attorneys. He looked, Vivian noted, like a man who had not slept well in approximately 14 days. The polished certainty that had been so complete during the first session was still present, but it had the quality now of something maintained deliberately rather than something that came naturally. He sat down. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was, in that exchange, about 3 seconds of something that both of them recognized and neither of them named. Then Vivian opened her notepad and said, "Mr. Calloway, I want to remind you that this interview is being recorded and documented. You have the right to have your legal counsel present throughout, which they are. This interview concerns the matters outlined in the investigation scope document provided to your team 2 weeks ago. Are you ready to proceed?" "Yes," he said, and they began. The interview lasted 4 hours and 18 minutes. It covered the charitable foundation disbursement patterns, the procurement contract approvals, the whistleblower complaint dismissals, the subsidiary ownership structures, and the specific decision-making processes that had produced the arrangements under review. Marcus answered every question. He did not deflect. He did not construct elaborate alternative narratives. He did not perform the particular variety of corporate theater that Vivian had witnessed in previous investigations, where powerful individuals attempt to manage an interview the way they manage a board presentation. He answered directly, specifically, with a candor that his own attorneys visibly found more forthcoming than they had anticipated, because at 3 points during the session one of them leaned toward Marcus and spoke quietly, and at each of those 3 points Marcus shook his head slightly and continued. What emerged from those 4 hours was a picture that was complicated in the way that institutional failures usually are. Some of what had happened at Callaway Continental was the result of deliberate decisions made at the senior level with full awareness of their implications. The subsidiary ownership connections, in particular. Marcus acknowledged, when pressed with the specific documentation Vivian's team had assembled, that he had been aware of the connections and had approved the disbursement structure. Some of what had happened was the result of a compliance culture that had been so thoroughly subordinated to growth objectives that the people responsible for flagging problems had understood, without being explicitly told, that flagging problems was professionally inadvisable. This was the more corrosive pattern, and it was the one that Marcus, when Vivian put the question to him directly, acknowledged in terms that went beyond the narrow legal requirement. I created an environment, he said, where people understood that raising concerns was a career risk. I did not say that explicitly. I did not have to say it explicitly. I demonstrated it through the way I responded to concerns over time, and the people around me learned the lesson I was teaching. I own that. The room was quiet after that sentence. Even the court reporter paused for a fraction of a second before resuming. Vivian made a note. She looked up from the notepad. "Mr. Callaway," she said. "One final question for this session." "Yes," he said. "The 3 whistleblower complaints that were filed internally over the 18-month period. 2 were dismissed by the compliance department. 1 contained a direct reference to a conversation with you. Were you aware of the substance of the concerns raised in those complaints before they were dismissed?" His attorneys exchanged a look. Marcus looked at Vivian. Then he said, "Yes." One word, delivered without performance or mitigation. "And the dismissals?" Vivian asked. "Were consistent with the environment I had created," he said, "which means they were ultimately my responsibility." Vivian held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Thank you for your cooperation today. We will be in touch regarding next steps." She closed her notepad. She reached forward and pressed the stop indicator on the recording device. The red light went out. The court reporter closed her equipment. The 2 attorneys began gathering papers. And then Marcus said, quietly and without looking at his attorneys, "Ms. Brooks." Vivian looked at him. "I wonder," he said, "if I might have a brief private word before you leave." His attorneys both moved to object simultaneously. Marcus stopped them with a single look. Vivian considered for precisely 3 seconds. Then she said to her colleagues, "Give us 5 minutes, please." The room cleared. The door closed. Vivian and Marcus Callaway sat alone in the conference room on the 31st floor with the city spread out behind the glass wall, and the small red recording light dark, and the silence between them carrying the weight of 31 years. 5 minutes, 31 years, and the truth that could not wait any longer. Marcus looked at his hands on the table for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I read the letters," he said. Vivian was very still. "I did not know about them," he said. "Not the content. The letters existed and were handled by my legal team per instructions I had given without understanding what those instructions would prevent from reaching me. I am not offering that as an excuse. I am offering it as the most accurate account of what happened that I can give you." Vivian said nothing. "I also know," he continued, "about the phone calls, and about a morning outside a conference center where you tell me a woman tried to speak to me directly and was prevented from doing so." She noted his careful phrasing. "You tell me," because he was not saying she told him. He was acknowledging that he had gone looking for the information himself. "I spent 22 years, Marcus said, convinced that my success was the complete story of my life, that the version of events I had constructed was accurate, that the people I had moved past had simply not been able to keep up." He stopped. He looked at the glass wall. "I was wrong about that," he said. "I was wrong about it in ways that I am still discovering. And the discovering is not comfortable." Vivian sat with her hands folded on the table in front of her. Her expression was the same composed, attentive expression she had maintained throughout 4 hours of formal interview. But her eyes were doing something different now. Not soft. Vivian's eyes were never soft in a professional context, but present in a way that went beyond professional. "What is it that you want from this 5 minutes?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "I want to tell you," he said, "that what I did at the gala was inexcusable. I want to tell you that, and have it be something other than a strategic statement." "It was inexcusable," she agreed. "Simply. without decoration. Yes, he said. Is there more? He was quiet for a moment. I want to ask, he said, and here his voice changed almost imperceptibly, carrying something that it had not carried at any point in the previous 4 hours, something unguarded and uncertain and genuinely uncomfortable to witness in a man who had spent 2 decades making comfort look effortless. I want to ask if there is any version of this in which your mother would be willing to hear from me, not to undo anything, not to ask for anything. I understand that ship has long since left the harbor, and I have only myself to credit for its departure. I simply want to know if there is any version in which she would be willing to hear the word sorry, spoken to her face by the person who owes it. The room was completely quiet. Vivian looked at him for a long time. She thought about a kitchen table and a 12-year-old girl with a photograph. She thought about bread and soup on a cold winter evening. She thought about homemade birthday cakes and strawberries cut into tiny stars. She thought about a woman sitting on a bench in a lobby with her back straight and her hands folded and her dignity entirely intact. She thought about what her mother had said to her every single time she asked about her father through all the years of growing up. Sometimes good people lose themselves before they find their way back. She had never asked her mother if she actually believed that. She thought, sitting in this room, that maybe she did. That, Vivian said carefully, is not my answer to give. He nodded. He had expected this. But, she said, I will tell you this. My mother is one of the most honest people alive. If you approach her with anything other than complete honesty, she will know before you have finished the first sentence, and the conversation will be over. He looked at her, and, Vivian said, if you approach her with complete honesty, I do not know what she will say, because that decision belongs entirely to her, and I would not attempt to predict or influence it. I understand, he said. I am not endorsing this, Mr. Calloway, she said precisely. I am simply answering your question. I know, he said. She stood. She picked up her notepad and her briefcase. She walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the handle. Without turning around, she said she still volunteers at the public library on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Adult literacy program. She paused. She has been doing it for 11 years. She opened the door. She walked out. She had not looked back. The library, the Tuesday evening, and the conversation that had been 22 years in the making. Marcus Calloway stood outside the public library on a Tuesday evening 3 weeks later. He was not wearing a charcoal suit selected by someone whose professional existence revolved around his image. He was wearing a plain dark jacket and gray trousers that he had chosen himself and which were perfectly respectable and entirely unremarkable, which was the point. He had driven himself. Not the car service he used for everything, his own car, a vehicle he had purchased 2 years ago for reasons he could not fully articulate at the time and now understood perhaps more clearly. He stood on the sidewalk for 8 minutes before going in. This is an important detail. Marcus Calloway, who walked into every room as though it had been arranged for his benefit, stood on a public sidewalk outside a library for 8 minutes working up the particular courage that is required not for big dramatic gestures, but for genuine, undefended honesty. Then he went in. The library was warm and well lit and smelled the way libraries smell, like paper and quiet and the accumulated weight of stories waiting to be found. A librarian at the front desk directed him to the community room at the back of the second floor, where the Tuesday evening program took place. He climbed the stairs. He heard her voice before he saw her. She was reading aloud to a small group seated around a table. A passage from what sounded like a short story. Something about a man returning to a town he had left decades before and finding that the town had continued without him in ways he had not expected. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. Their eyes met for the second time in 22 years. This time, there was no microphone between them. No 300 guests. No cameras. No stage. Just a hallway with fluorescent lights and the sound of story mid-sentence, and two people looking at each other across the particular distance that only time can create and only honesty can begin to cross. She said something quietly to the group, who murmured and settled with the easy patience of people accustomed to her gentle management of the room. Then she stood and walked toward the doorway. She stopped 2 feet from him. She looked at him steadily. He opened his mouth, and then he did something that no press release, no corporate statement, no carefully managed public narrative could have prepared anyone who knew him for. He said very quietly, "I am sorry, Diana." Not the practiced version. Not the version designed to manage the room or protect the narrative. The real one. Spoken by the young man from the tiny office with the mismatched desks. Not by the CEO of a company under federal investigation. Spoken by the person who had once held her face in both hands and promised he would spend the rest of his life making sure she never sacrificed another thing for him. She looked at him for a long moment. "I know about the letters," he said. "I read them. All three. I know about the calls. I know about the morning outside the conference center. I know that you tried." He paused. "I know what I cost you. I know I cannot repay it. And I am not here to ask you to accept anything you are not ready to give. I am here because I owe you the truth spoken to your face. I owe you that at minimum." Diana was quiet. The room behind her was very still. She looked at him in the way that Diana Brooks looked at things she was genuinely considering. Steadily, patiently, without performance. Then she said, "You have a daughter." "I know," he said. "She built herself," Diana said. "Without you. I want you to understand that before anything else. She built herself, and she is extraordinary, and that is not a credit that belongs to you." "I know that," he said. "I want you to know it completely," Diana said. "Not as a statement of blame. As a fact. She is who she is because of what she chose and what she worked for and the value she developed from living a life that did not have your resources in it. I want you to hold that clearly." "I do," he said. Diana was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "What is it that you want, Marcus?" He considered the question with the full weight it deserved. "I want to be someone she does not have to be ashamed of," he said. "And I want to tell you that I am sorry. Properly. Not as a transaction. Just as the truth." Diana looked at him for a very long time. Then she said, "I accepted a long time ago that you were not capable of being who I needed you to be. I stopped being angry about it somewhere around the time Vivian learned to read, which she did at 3 years and 4 months because she had your instincts for processing information even without ever having met you." She paused. "I'm not interested in resuming anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking for that," he said. "Good," she said. "Then what I will say is this." She straightened slightly. The letters deserved a response. That morning outside the conference center deserved a response. Vivian deserved a father who showed up. None of those things happened. I have made my peace with them. But if you are genuinely asking whether there is a path towards some kind of honesty between you and your daughter, then that is a question I cannot answer for you. That is between you and her. "I know," he said. "She will not make it easy for you," Diana said. "She should not make it easy for you." "I know that too," he said. Diana looked at him for one final moment. Then she said, "Good night, Marcus." She turned and walked back toward the community room. She did not slam a door or deliver a final devastating line. She simply returned to the people waiting for her to finish reading the story, which was, in its own quiet way, the most powerful thing she could have done. Marcus stood in the hallway for another minute. Then he went back down the stairs, out through the warm library that smelled like paper and quiet and stories, and onto the sidewalk where his unremarkable car was parked at the curb. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine. What accountability actually looks like. The Oversight Committee's findings on Callaway Continental Industries were released 8 weeks after the formal investigation concluded. The report ran to 214 pages. It documented the charitable foundation irregularities in full. It documented the procurement contract patterns. It documented the whistleblower dismissals and the compliance culture failure. It contained the formal interview record, including Marcus Callaway's direct acknowledgments of responsibility. It recommended a formal restructuring of the company's compliance and governance systems, the appointment of an independent compliance monitor for a period of 3 years, the repayment of all improperly allocated charitable funds with interest, and a civil financial penalty that represented the largest such penalty the oversight body had imposed in 7 years. It did not recommend criminal referral. This was not because the findings were lenient. The findings were thorough and unsparing. It was because the evidence, as documented, indicated institutional failure and deliberate avoidance of proper process, but did not rise to the threshold of criminal conduct, as defined under the applicable statutes. And because Marcus Calloway's cooperation during the investigation, including his direct acknowledgement of personal responsibility for the compliance culture, had been the kind of substantive, documentable cooperation that the oversight process is designed to reward with the specific remedy of civil rather than criminal resolution. Vivian signed the final report on a Thursday morning. She read it once through from beginning to end before signing. Then she signed it. She dated it. She passed it to Gerald Whitmore, who co-signed it as firm oversight partner. Then she went to her desk, made a cup of tea, and called her mother. "It is done," she said. "Are you all right?" Diana asked. "Yes," Vivian said. "Are you certain?" "I am certain that we did the work correctly," Vivian said. "And I'm certain that it was right. The rest of the feelings I will sort through later." "Come for dinner on Saturday," Diana said. "I will make the soup." "I will be there," Vivian said. She ended the call. She drank her tea. She looked out the window of her office at the city that contained, somewhere within it, a man reading a 214-page document about the cost of decisions made without integrity, and a woman returning to a garden in the evenings where tomatoes grew through sheer personal stubbornness, and a library where adults learned to read for the first time at 53, and a community of people who left casseroles outside neighbors' doors when someone was sick. All of it, the empire and the garden and the library and the city, existing simultaneously, as it always had. Marcus issued a public statement the same day the report was released. His communications team had prepared 3 different versions for his consideration. The first was the standard corporate response language, professionally calibrated to acknowledge findings while minimizing reputational damage. The second was slightly more direct, but still carefully structured around legal protection. The third was what his communications director described as the nuclear option, which was full, unmanaged personal acknowledgement with no protective language. Marcus discarded versions 1 and 2. He rewrote version 3 himself. It took him 2.5 hours. The statement he released said, among other things, that the findings of the independent review were accurate and that he accepted them in their entirety. That the failures documented were not the failures of a system that had run beyond his awareness, but of a culture that he had personally cultivated and was personally responsible for. That the people who had filed whistleblower complaints had done so at professional risk to themselves because of an environment he had created, and that they deserved both acknowledgement and protection going forward. That the restructuring and monitoring requirements were not punitive obstacles to be managed, but necessary corrections that the company, under his leadership, had made necessary. It was the most honest public document that had ever carried his name. His board read it and called an emergency meeting. His communications team read it, and one of them, a young woman who had been with the company for 2 years, sent an internal note to a colleague that said simply, "I did not know he had this in him." The financial press covered it with a particular mixture of surprise and respect that a genuinely unexpected act of public integrity generates when it comes from someone whose public image has been constructed around invulnerability. Several of the business publications that had featured Marcus on their covers over the years ran follow-up pieces. The most widely read one was titled, "The Anatomy of an Apology That Actually Meant Something." He did not read it. He was busy. He had sent Vivian a letter, not through legal channels or corporate communication or the elaborate buffer systems that had once made his life impenetrable. A personal letter, handwritten on plain paper. It said that he understood if she chose never to respond, and that this was his only expectation in sending it. It said that he had read everything publicly available about her professional work, and that what he found there told him more about the kind of person she had become than anything else could, and that the person she had become was someone he had no claim on and no right to take pride in, but could not help admiring from the appropriate distance. It said that if she ever decided she wanted to have a conversation, any kind of conversation about anything at all, he would be available. It said he was sorry for every version of absence she had grown up inside. It said he was sorry for what he had done at the gala. It said he was sorry for the walls that had kept her mother's letters from reaching him in time. It said, at the end, in the handwriting of a man who had spent 20 years writing only documents of strategic consequence and was finding the experience of writing something genuinely personal almost physically unfamiliar, that her mother was the most honest person he had ever known, and that whatever Vivian was that was remarkable had its deepest roots in that honesty and in the love behind it. He sealed it. He addressed it to her office. He mailed it himself at the post office 2 blocks from the apartment building he had grown up in and not visited in 23 years, which he had driven to without fully understanding why until he was standing at the post office counter and realized that he was trying, in some inarticulate way, to go back to the place where things had still been simple and true and hand something honest forward from there. Vivian received the letter on a Monday. She read it at her desk with her door closed and her tea cooling beside her notepad. She read it twice. Then she opened the bottom left drawer of her desk and took out the small wooden box she kept there, the box that had belonged to her mother and that Diana had given her when she left for law school, saying only, "These are the things worth keeping." She placed the letter in the box beside the photograph of 2 young people laughing in front of a small rented office. She closed the box. She put it back in the drawer. She picked up her pen. She pulled a blank piece of paper toward her, and she began to write. The dinner, the garden, and the day, everything quietly changed. Diana Brooks was in her garden on a Saturday afternoon in late spring when the gate opened and 2 people walked in. One of them she expected. Vivian came every 3rd Saturday when the schedule permitted and had since her first year of law school when the distance had made every visit feel more deliberate and therefore more significant. The other person she had not expected. Marcus Calloway stood at the gate in a plain jacket and ordinary trousers and held a small container of something that, when he extended it slightly, turned out to be a jar of preserves from a local market near the neighborhood he had mentioned in his letter, having driven to on the day he mailed it. Diana stood in the garden with her gardening gloves still on. She looked at him. She looked at Vivian. Vivian said, very simply, he asked if he could come. "I told him that was your decision. I called you yesterday to warn you, and you did not answer." "I was at the library," Diana said. "I know," Vivian said. "Mom, what do you want to do?" Diana looked at Marcus. He looked back at her without any of the managed performance that had characterized every public version of him for 2 decades. He looked like the young man from the photograph. Not literally. Time had done to both of them what time does. But in his expression, in the absence of the careful construction, he looked uncertain and present and genuinely sorry in a way that was not designed to achieve anything. Diana pulled off one gardening glove, then the other. She set them on the small outdoor table. "There is soup on the stove," she said, "and bread baked this morning. You can come in for lunch if you want to." She turned and walked toward the back door without waiting to see if he would follow. He looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at the garden. "She grows tomatoes," Vivian said. "She is unreasonably proud of them." "Are they good?" Marcus asked. "They are extraordinary," Vivian said. "She will tell you it is the soil. It is actually the stubbornness." He almost smiled. Almost. Then Vivian walked toward the door. After a moment, Marcus followed. The lunch lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. No one resolved 22 years in 2 hours and 40 minutes. That is not how resolution works, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But some things happened at that table that had not happened before. Marcus answered Vivian's questions about his childhood, about the period before the money, about the version of himself that had existed in the tiny office with the mismatched desks. He answered them without managing the answers, without editing, without selecting the details that reflected most favorably and discarding the rest. Vivian asked questions that were precise and occasionally uncomfortable in the way that Vivian's questions always were, and Marcus answered them in the way of a man who has spent several months discovering that discomfort, when leaned into rather than avoided, has a quality of relief to it. Diana mostly listened. Occasionally she asked something. Small things. Specific things. The questions of a woman who is not yet ready to engage fully, but is willing to be present. At one point, she stood to refill the breadbasket, and Marcus said, without planning to, "I told my board last week that the most honest thing I've said publicly in 10 years was the statement I released after the investigation." One of them asked me what prompted it. I told them I met someone whose standard of integrity I found genuinely impossible to argue with. Diana came back to the table with the breadbasket. She sat down. She said, "How did that go over?" He asked if the person was a lawyer. Marcus said. I said yes. He said that figured. Diana looked at Vivian. Vivian was looking at her soup, but there was, at the corners of her mouth, the faintest beginning of something. Not a full smile, but its approaching edge. And in a family whose language had always been less about what was said and more about what was felt behind it, that was enough to mean something. This is Echoes of the Heart with Dr. Collins. And before we reach the closing chapter of this story, I want to speak to you honestly for just one moment. I did not tell you this story to suggest that every wound heals completely. I did not tell you this story to suggest that sorry is always enough, or that people who caused great harm deserve easy forgiveness, or that 22 years of absence can be repaired over soup and bread on a Saturday afternoon. None of those things are true. What I told you this story to suggest is this: that the capacity for accountability, for genuine, undefended, strategically unprotected honesty about the harm we have caused, is one of the most important capacities a human being can develop. That dignity, the kind Diana Brooks carried out of a ballroom and into a library and through 22 years of raising a daughter alone, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the thing that makes everything else possible. That the quiet, determined work of building something real, a child, a life, a character, a library program, a garden with stubborn tomatoes, is the work that outlasts every empire. And that sometimes when a person has been lost long enough to understand the full cost of being lost, they find their way back. Not to what was, but to something new, something that could only have been built from the wreckage of what was lost and the honesty of what remained. Echoes of the Heart. 6 months after that Saturday lunch, Vivian Brooks was asked to deliver a keynote address at a national legal ethics conference. The address was titled, "What Integrity Costs and Why It Is Worth the Price." She spoke for 42 minutes. She did not mention Marcus Calloway by name. She did not mention the investigation. She spoke about a woman she knew who had worked 2 jobs and baked birthday cakes with wrong flavor frosting and cut strawberries into tiny stars with a paring knife, and never once made the person beside her feel that love was subject to scarcity. She spoke about what it means to build something with your hands in the absence of recognition, and to continue building anyway. She spoke about the moment she sat in a document review room 31 floors above a city and felt not triumph, but grief at the waste of what poor choices had cost a genuinely capable man. She spoke about integrity as a daily practice rather than a permanent achievement, about how it is not something you arrive at once and keep forever, about how it has to be chosen again and again, in small rooms and large ones, in the moments when no one is watching, and especially in the moments when everyone is. At the end of the address, there was a long silence before the applause began. The kind of silence that a room makes when something genuinely true has just been said in it. Afterward, a young attorney who had been in the audience came up to her and said, "The woman you described, the one who cut the strawberries, is she real?" Vivian looked at her. "Yes," she said. "She sounds remarkable," the young attorney said. "She is," Vivian said. "She has been remarkable for as long as I have known her, which is my entire life." She shook the young attorney's hand and moved on. In the car on the way home, she called her mother. It was 8:30. Diana answered on the second ring. "How did it go?" Diana asked. "I talked about strawberry stars," Vivian said. A pause. Then Diana said, "I hope you told them the frosting was the wrong flavor." "I considered it," Vivian said. "I thought it might undermine the gravitas." "Vivian," Diana said, "the wrong flavor frosting is the whole point. That is what made it worth remembering." Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know, Mom." "Come for dinner next Saturday," Diana said. "Will there be soup?" "There will be soup," Diana said. "And there may or may not be another person at the table who called yesterday to ask if it was all right if he came." Vivian looked out the car window at the city going past. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him that was your decision," Diana said. "Which is true." Vivian watched the city for a moment. "Tell him yes," she said. A pause. Then Diana said, very quietly, "Okay." And in that single word, in the specific tone of its delivery, was something that Vivian had not heard in her mother's voice before in relation to this particular subject. Not resolution, not happiness exactly, not the end of 22 years of something difficult, but the beginning of something careful and honest and new, which was all things considered, exactly what both of them had earned. Final reflection. The greatest tragedies are rarely born from hatred. We said that at the beginning of this story. They are born from pride, from words spoken in anger, from decisions made from fear dressed up as certainty, from the slow, incremental erosion of empathy that happens when success is allowed to rewrite memory. But here's what this story also shows us. The greatest recoveries are rarely dramatic either. They do not arrive with a single speech or grand gesture or a scene designed for maximum emotional impact. They arrive in hallways and libraries and gardens, in handwritten letters and 5-minute conversations and jars of preserves from a local market, in 2 hours and 40 minutes of soup and bread and precise, uncomfortable questions honestly answered. They arrive in the daily, undramatic, deeply human work of choosing to be honest when comfortable silence is available, choosing to show up when absence is easier, choosing to say I was wrong in a room where saying so costs something real. Diana Brooks built a life and a daughter and a garden and a library community from the materials of her own dignity and love. Vivian Brooks built a career and a reputation and a standard of integrity from the materials her mother gave her. Marcus Calloway built an empire, and then, slowly, painfully, and only when the full cost of what he had built and what he had destroyed finally arrived on his desk in the form of 3 cream-colored letters, he began the harder, more important work of building something he had never prioritized before: his own character, in the actual, uncurated, unedited version, which is the only version that was ever worth anything. That is the story of Echoes of the Heart. Thank you for being here. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone you love, or someone you owe a conversation or a moment of honesty, please share it today. Not for the algorithm, for that person. Leave a comment telling me the line or the moment in this story that stayed with you the most. I read every single one, and they matter to me deeply. If you're new to this channel, subscribe right now so you never miss a story. We are here every week with the kind of storytelling that takes the complicated, real, messy truth of human experience and treats it with the honesty it deserves. This is Dr. Collins, and this has been Echoes of the Heart. Until the next story, take care of each other, and cut the strawberries into stars.